So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. My name is Fahini and I'm one of the ambassadors at You OK Doc. I joined the charity last summer following my own experiences with anxiety, stress, and burnout, wanting to carry out work to support others going through similar experiences. Um, for
I
those of
don't care
you
if you don't hear it.
for those of you who are new to YOD, YOD is a non-profit organisation supporting doctors. The charity was founded in 2019 following the tragic death of Dr. Liz Seisler, a consultant anaesthetist and a family member of our founder, Daniel Guerin. Our mission is to change the perceptions of mental health for those working in the medical sector and to help develop bespoke mental health support for doctors. Um, Obviously, this month is Stress Awareness Month, and with the rates of stress, anxiety, and burnout continuing to rise and burden the medical community, we felt it was particularly important to focus on
But it's stress awareness month, so it's fair.
Yeah, so it's Stress Awareness Month. So we wanted to utilize this opportunity to kind of focus on stress and mental health in the medical community. We are extremely grateful to Dr. Cordelia Peel, who is a medic turned life coach, who for kindly putting together this workshop series to help us understand and tackle burnout and stress in the medical community. Before we go on, obviously it's an interactive session, but to kind of avoid any interruptions, we'd really appreciate it if you could mute your microphones whilst Cordelia is speaking, and then obviously unmute when it becomes more interactive, just to kind of get rid of any background noise. Feel free to use the chat function to answer, raise any questions or raise your hand, and we'll try and address them as we go along. And lastly, we are recording this session with the hope to turn it into a podcast. Names and your identity will be obscured because it's a podcast. But if you would like to maintain anonymity, then please just turn your camera off and mute when necessary. And thank you once again for joining. We really appreciate all your support, and we'd love to hear your feedback at the end. We'll be sending out a survey at the end, and any kind of feedback and support you give us will be invaluable to helping us tailor future webinars to your needs. Thank you. Cordelia, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Excellent. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and well done for giving yourself this time to be here. I'm going to make sure that it's well worth your investment of time and energy. So my name is Cordelia. I've been a medical doctor for over a decade, working primarily in emergency medicine and acute stroke. But now I'm a high performance coach, helping people just like you to have breakthroughs, have impact, and ultimately create ever increasing levels of well-being and external success. But when my clients start with me, they're usually exhausted, confused, full of self-doubt, stressed and overwhelmed, sometimes even anxious, depressed, or burnt out. There's a change that they want to make, something in their health, their careers, their relationships, something that if they could just achieve it would bring huge amounts of fulfillment and satisfaction to them. But they've hit a roadblock. They're unable to make progress. They've become stuck. And they've been stuck for so long that they're now experiencing significant psychological discomfort as a result of this lack of progress. So my job is to help them to achieve this change and have this breakthrough, whilst also helping them to get their A game back. And I do this with a 4-pillar approach that I took from my study of integrated medicine, which encompasses mind, body, relationships, and ambition, where I help them to become the best version of themselves by elevating every arena of their lives. So tonight, I'm here to share with you some of the tools and strategies I use in my coaching to help reduce the detrimental impact that chronic stress is having in your life. Because chronic stress and burnout is a big problem, and it's one of the biggest enemies of high achievers. And the reason I do what I do is because for a long time, I was stuck myself. So that's me in 2017. an ACCS trainee with a London training number that I fought really hard to get. Knowing what I now know, I was in what's called the honeymoon phase of burnout, which we will discuss more in detail in our second workshop on Wednesday. And it's characterized by enthusiasm, which is clear from the look on my face. I think the problem with the situation that I was in was, whilst I absolutely loved so many aspects of being a doctor, mostly the meaning and purpose it brought to my life, it never really felt like it was my decision. My dad was really keen on me becoming a doctor. It was a dream he had for himself, a version of success that met his worldview. And since I was good at science and I was great with people, I was really heavily encouraged to go down this route. And because I really wanted to fulfill his expectations and make him happy, this is what I did. But there was always this little voice inside of me that was telling me that it wasn't what I wanted. And for years, I suppressed it. I pushed it down and I tried to ignore it. The thing, when we do this, when we ignore our feelings, our truth, that slowly eats away from us on the inside. And for years, I would cycle through periods of feeling very low in mood, not sleeping, being very emotional with big outbursts, and generally feeling quite unstable. These periods would last for a few days, sometimes a week or two, and then they would spontaneously lift. And I'd come out of these phases feeling a little confused. But I never once took a day off work. I continued to function highly. And now what I understand is that I was suffering from something called high functioning depression, which means you're suffering from depression, but you continue to function, go to work, do everything that is required of you and more, yet inside you're feeling really down, quite empty and lonely. So perhaps because it didn't feel like it was my decision, or perhaps because I used to have this limiting belief that I was not good enough, I used to push myself beyond what was healthy or necessary in an attempt to prove that I was good enough and I did deserve to have that London training number. Between 2016, before that photo was first taken, and 2018, I was doing a ridiculous number of stuff, which I'm sure some of you guys are doing too. I was doing my MRCP exams. I did my GNC instructor course for ALS. I was doing multiple radiology courses. I was on the RSM committee, OSCE committee, holding training events for 100 to 200 trainees at a time, running those events single-handedly. I then produced the RSM's first clinical training video, which was a job that I'd never done before, putting together a production team, an editor, and creating that product. I was mentoring doctors, junior doctors at Barnet. I just bought my first house. I'd entered a new relationship. And I was running a passion project of a pop-up restaurant on the side whilst commuting 2 to 2.5 hours a day. What I was expecting from myself was not just unrealistic, but I realize now that it was completely unreasonable. And as you can see, it took its toll. In 2018, things took a turn for me. In that picture, you can see I've got cold sores on my face, covered in rashes. I was exhausted. I'm pale. I'm emotionally unstable. I was not sleeping. I'm not really sure what happened over those 6 months. It was quite a blur, but perhaps as a result of crying so much, I couldn't stop crying and rubbing my eyes all the time. I developed an orbital cellulitis in my eyes and I was on antibiotics for 4 weeks. But with no resolution of that orbital cellulitis, they took me in and operated on my eye and drained 5 infected chalazions from my eyelid. And that photo in 2018, the second one, is the day after my operation where I looked like I'd been punched in the face. It was only when I was at that crisis point and I was laying in a chair having needles stuck in my eyes did I have to have that really honest conversation with myself and say, Cordelia, what are you doing? Is this really it? I saw my program training director. She took one look at me and said, you're burning out. You need a week, you need some time off. And I was given just 1 week by my clinical supervisor. And that was not enough. And we'll discuss more about that on Wednesday. So the right decision for me at that time, because it didn't feel like the path that I wanted to be on, was to hand in my resignation, which I did 2 months later. I was scared. I had no idea of what I was doing next, but I couldn't pretend anymore. That suppression of my emotions and my feelings was killing me. And it was about a year after that I lost my 47-year-old brother to suicide. He was 47 years old, no previous history of mental health, with 2 young children. And that was a wake-up call. That was a wake-up call really for me to follow my dreams. Life is short. In the back of my mind, I'd always wanted to run my own business in health and wellness. So 6 months after his death, I got a business coach, continued to locum on the side whilst building this business. And that's actually me in 2020 on the front line of COVID, probably under the biggest amounts of stress I've ever experienced working as a doctor, yet probably being in the best health I've ever been, road testing the techniques and tools I teach today whilst carrying out my final acts of service as a medical doctor. And then in 2022, pictured running my first ever group burnout coaching program. So look, I'm sharing this story with you because I want you to know that wherever you are right now, you are not alone. I know we feel incredible amounts of shame when we're going through these mental health problems, but I'm sharing my story with you and being vulnerable, and I want you to know that you're not alone. So what are we going to cover today? I seem to have lost the colors on my screen for some reason. I'm just gonna, can you guys just give me 1 second? Sorry, I'm gonna reshare my screen because we seem to be missing a few things. Hold on. And we'll do this. Thank you for your patience. There we go. Sorry, so you're going to have a little bit of background on there, but I don't want you to miss any of the images that I have got up. So sorry about that. Right. So what are we going to talk about today? So my aim is to refresh your memory about what stress is doing to your body. Until I went through burnout, oh, that's happening the same. So sorry, we'll just leave it like that. I hadn't actually touched on any of this knowledge since medical school, but it's imperative to have this understanding because this then gives insight into ways we can bolster ourselves against the negative impact that stress is having on us by doing what we can to reverse these changes. So we need to refresh our knowledge a bit. I then hope to give you some information that you don't know about stress, the different types of stress, what triggers psychological stress, the relationship between stress and performance, and how, at a cognitive level, you can change your experience to stress. And finally, we're going to move into 3 concepts to help reduce stress. You will need a pen and a paper because whilst this knowledge is useful, it's not powerful until you apply it to your life and your circumstances. So I need you to get involved here today. As we said, we want this to be interactive as possible. Please jump into the chat box. I'd love us to create a real sense of community and belonging here. Put your questions in there. I'll try and answer them as I go through when we break for questions, or I'll do that at the end. And then listed at the end of this presentation is a load of books and papers to support some of the knowledge I'm delivering to you today. So, psychological stress. Stress can be physical or psychological in nature. Today, we're solely focusing on psychological stress. So let's dive into the basics that I believe are really important for us to know and understand so we can make decisions and take action based on a foundation of really powerful knowledge and understanding. So, stress is your body's internal reaction to a demand placed upon it. It's a state of threatened homeostasis provoked by a stressor. Now, in terms of psychological stress, there are 4 triggers, and you can remember these from the acronym NUTS: novelty, uncertainty, something that poses a threat to your ego, such as the risk of failure, judgment, or criticism, and where you've lost a sense of control. So remember the acronym NUTS. Now, if you take a moment to think back to a situation recently that's evoked stress in you, you will see that the situation has involved one of these 3 triggers. For example, an exam you're taking is novel, is something you've not done before. The contents of the exam is uncertain. You don't know what's going to come up. And if you don't pass it and you fail, that is a threat to your ego. And that is going to generate stress. So as we remember from med school, when we're exposed to these stress triggers, there's the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And we've got the release of the stress hormones, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. Now, this is important for you to remember. Gas is your body's basic reaction pattern to a stressor, irrespective of the agent that provoked the stress. So this is the stages that we all move through. Now, this was defined by somebody called Hans Sell, who's known as the godfather of stress, for his huge contribution he's made to our current understanding. And there are 3 stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. And it's really important to know these so you can gauge where you are at. So alarm is your initial reaction, right? The fight or flight response. So this is preparing you to fight or flee. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up. So during this stage, you're going to be more cognitively alert, your energy levels are going to go up. All of that is with the aim of giving you the ability to protect yourself from danger. Then, if you overcome the stressor, the body repairs itself. So everything goes back to normal. Your hormone levels, heart rate will all go back to pre-stress levels. However, if that stressor persists in your life, your body adapts itself in order to cope with the ongoing stressor. And this is where at a biological level, you go through a number of changes that can lead to pathophysiology. During this stage, you will experience ongoing irritability, frustration, and loss of concentration. Then lastly, we have the exhaustion stage. This is when your body's resistance is declining and it's losing the ability to cope with the ongoing stressor. It's breaking down. During this stage, you might experience persistent fatigue, anxiety, depression, and burnout. You become physically, mentally, and emotionally drained to the point where the body no longer has the strength to fight the stressor. So thinking about those and what I've now explained, where would you say you're at right now? Which one of these three stages sounds like you? Are you at alarm? Are you in resistance? Or you're at the exhaustion stage? Because the thing is, we weren't built to withstand chronic stress. That is stress that persists for 6 weeks or more. We were built to withstand short, acute bursts of stress interspersed with periods of rest and recovery where everything normalizes, our physiology normalizes. And it's basically this changing of our set point that leads to damage of our brains and bodies. So it's this, what starts out as this kind of healthy response that's protecting us from danger through a series of these physiological changes that are shown on the left side here, that soon becomes dangerous when they persist for too long, as demonstrated on the right side here. And that's what eventually leads to illness and disease. Now, there's two aspects of these changes that I'm going to hone in on today, because these are going to shed some light on how we should go about making ourselves a bit more stress-proof, and that's chronic inflammation and the brain changes that result from chronic stress. So, do you know that chronic inflammation increases your risk of depression? Because back in 2018, when I was sick, I didn't know this. And had I known it, there were a lot of things I could have done to protect myself from generating unnecessary inflammation that I was actually potentiating in my body, not just through chronic stress, but also through really poor lifestyle choices, drinking, smoking, poor dietary habits. Now, there's a lot of data that suggests inflammatory responses have an important role in the pathophysiology of depression. Depressed patients have been found to have higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, acute phase proteins. Biologically, they're inflamed. And then when they make healthy people inflamed, which they've done through administration of the cytokine interferon alpha, and also by creating a low-grade inflammation in people where they basically fed study participants processed foods, processed meat, and fried food, as their inflammation rose, their mental health deteriorated. And there was also a brilliant trial that treated patients with treatment-resistant depression with infliximab infusions. And in patients who had higher infusion and baseline inflammatory markers, there were significant improvements in their symptoms of depression. So the bottom line here is that chronic inflammation is dangerous for all aspects of our health, both mental and physical, with clear links being demonstrated between the presence of chronic inflammation that we know results sometimes from chronic stress and our increasing risk of mental health disorders like depression. But what's happening in our brain? Because chronic stress changes your brain structurally and in terms of the neural circuitry. Now, in order to understand the impact that chronic stress has on our brain, I want to remind you of the two sides of your brain. But we all know that there aren't two sides of the brain. However, for the purpose of simplicity, I'll be referring to the network of brain cells that process emotions as your emotional brain, and the networks in your prefrontal cortex that are involved in goal-directed decision-making, emotional regulation as your rational brain. Now, your prefrontal cortex is involved in regulating your emotions. If it decides that it's in your best interests to stay on high alert for possible threats, it raises the volume of your emotional response. But if it thinks your emotions are unnecessary or distracting, it can mute your emotional response. And since your prefrontal cortex regulates emotional reactivity, it plays a vital role in your susceptibility to stress. Now, they've imaged people's brains in chronically stressed individuals, and they've seen that there's shrinking of the prefrontal cortex, a reduced volume in the hippocampus, and a swelling of the amygdala. So what this means is the emotional brain is getting turned up. It becomes more powerful. And as a result, the emotional regulatory skills of the prefrontal cortex are getting turned down. So your emotional responses are becoming disproportionate to what the situation warrants. You may become irrational. You're not able to downregulate your emotions. It's actually associated with burnout. And the problem with this is when you can't regulate your emotions and they surface easy, they can easily take over your mind, right? Your whole worldview starts to change. You dwell on negative features more than positive ones, and this can make you feel more anxious and on edge. And at this state, when you're in this state, you're going to become less resilient. You're more likely to experience emotional distress. It becomes this perpetuating cycle that started with chronic stress and the changes on our brain that comes at a cost to our emotional health. So the bottom line here is that chronic stress changes our brain. But is all stress bad? Because I think there's this common misconception that all stress is bad, but it's not. And then that makes us feel stressed about being stressed. Chronic stress is bad, but not all stress is bad. So it's actually only small acute bursts of stress that we need, and they're actually really important for our performance. So this is the Yerkes-Dodson law, which depicts the relationship between stress and performance. Now, this law dictates that performance increases with mental arousal or stress, but only until a point. When you have no stress at all, kind of reminds me of some of the lectures I was in, used to be in med school, you're bored, you're unengaged, and it shows in your performance. You don't perform well with no stress at all. However, too much stress for too long pushes you into this distress zone where you become exhausted, panicky, anxious. Stay there too long, you're going to burn out. So what is important to remember here is that in order for us to thrive, we need an optimal amount of stress. We want to stay here in this middle zone, which I call the zone of high performance, where there's just enough stress to make you mentally alert, maximize your growth in learning, but not so much that it becomes overwhelming. So we don't want to get rid of stress completely. We need some stress to perform at our best. But how come some people perform better under pressure than others? What's their secret? Well, interestingly, a stressful situation or stressor on its own doesn't predict stress or how you will react. Stresses trigger a cognitive process whereby you assess harm or threat and your ability to cope with it. And this is the basis of something called the transactional model of stress and coping that was developed by Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman. Now, what Susan Folkman and Lazarus discovered is that the level of stress an individual experiences directly correlated to how confident they feel about their ability to deal with the threat. So this is a really important point because ultimately it's the way that we react or interpret an event or a stressor that's having a more powerful impact on the level of stress we're experiencing than the event itself. So how does this work? Ultimately, you've got a situation, right? And it's a perceived threat. You go through a secondary appraisal process whereby if you believe you have the ability to cope with the threat, you create something called a challenge response, which creates eustress or positive stress. This is performance enhancing. You become more focused, you become more productive, you have more energy, you generate positive emotions, and you feel motivated. It makes you thrive at a biological and psychological level. However, if you don't believe you have the ability to cope, you generate a threat response. And this generates negative stress, termed distress. Your performance suffers, you feel overwhelmed, you experience feelings of helplessness, you become flooded with negative emotions, you feel tired, your sleep goes off. Physiologically and psychologically, you nosedive. So this is why mindset is so important, because our beliefs play a pivotal role in shaping our whole experience of the world. There's a quote that I love by Henry Ford, and he says, "Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right." So one of the best things you can do is change your self-talk. Telling yourself you can't cope, you're useless, you're helpless, you're incompetent, or any other of those things is going to create a threat response and negative stress. And you will suffer at all levels in terms of your performance, psychologically and physiologically. Having self-belief, telling yourself that you have the ability to cope with it, and using this kind of positive language is going to change how you experience the stress in your life. When you talk to yourself like that, you have that self-belief, you're going to generate more positive emotions, you're going to feel that motivation, you're going to generate that challenge response. And when you're in that state and in that stressful situation with that mindset and that response, you're going to much more likely have a successful outcome. So how you talk to yourself during the difficult times and the beliefs you hold about yourself matter a lot in the context of stress. So, how's everyone doing? Are you all still with me? So now we're moving on to our critical concepts. So I'm going to do 3 concepts. The first is really about helping you get some clarity, because when we're really stressed, things become really confusing and overwhelming. So I want to help you get some clarity, help you see things a bit more clearly so that you can start looking at where you can make some choices today to reduce the stress in your life. Then we're going to move on to a two-pronged approach today to reduce stress. One through your mind, which can be the source of a lot of distress, as I will be showing you today, and one through the body. So look, I want to know, what's causing you stress right now? What is it? Get your pen and paper, write it down. At the moment, it's all up here. And we can't work with something when it's all just in our mind. Put it down on paper. But don't just say, oh, work is stressing me out. You need to be specific, because the more specific you are, the more powerful this exercise will be. Is anyone prepared to share anything in the chat box? What's stressing you out right now? What's on people's minds? Yes, Louisa, I can share the slides after the presentation. Absolutely. Right. So no one's jumping in the chat. That's fine. So what I want you to do is write it down. We can't solve a problem until we identify it. We've got to put it on paper. And now you've got 4 choices. In every stressful situation, you have 4 choices: avoid, alter, adapt, accept. Now, avoid. There's a lot of stress and aggravation in our life that we can simply walk away from and avoid. There's a lot in life we can't control. The only thing we have direct control over is our choices, our actions, and our behaviors. So we need to make choices and take action to reduce our exposure to the things that are provoking stress. If you can't avoid a stressor, then you need to think about ways that you can alter it by reducing your exposure to it or reducing that experience of stress. This might mean asking someone to change their behavior, communicating to them how it's making you feel rather than suffering in silence. It might mean cutting a really large project you're working down into smaller, more manageable chunks so they're less stressful. If you have a stressful commute, you might leave earlier to avoid all the chaos and the stress, or you might listen to an audiobook, put a podcast on, make it more enjoyable. Perhaps you've got a series of nights coming on that you're absolutely dreading. Why don't you make a plan with your colleagues to get some of your favorite food in every evening, so you have something to look forward to and you can have that sense of connection and belonging? Perhaps there's a family event you really don't want to attend, but you can't get out of it. Be upfront and state that you can only go for just 1 hour, and then because you've got an early start. Wherever you can't avoid a stressor, we can't just eliminate it altogether, then we need to think creatively about how you can alter or change it. But not everything that causes us stress in life is changeable. And if it's something that isn't, it's completely out of your control, we need to take action to learn to accept it. How do you do this? Acceptance doesn't mean pretending you don't feel the way you do. It starts with acknowledging that it's okay to feel that way. Validating your emotions is a massive part of acceptance, because as I've learned, the more we resist them, the more that they persist. Acceptance is really about making subtle shifts in the way we frame events, or talking to someone to help us come to terms with something, forgiving someone who's wronged us to help release the stress and energy of resentment and blame. If you failed an exam or not hit the mark, it's asking yourself the question, how, which engages your rational brain and forces you to carry out a fact-based analysis and identify areas for improvement, rather than sinking into the self-deprecating negativity of telling yourself that you're a failure. But over the long term, one of the best stress reduction strategies is about making lasting changes to our mindset, our goals, our expectations we have of ourselves, and the perception we have on stressful life events. When we adapt and we make these changes to our mindset, we make ourselves stronger, more resilient. We build a worldview or a mindset that empowers us. And this is at the heart of the work that I do with my clients. So what I'll be doing is covering some of this mindset work today, and then we'll be revisiting it in our session on Wednesday. So look, what is on your list that you can simply avoid? What can you just get rid of? Is there anything that you could, just looking at that list that you've written, that you just want to get rid of? Can you change the way you're doing something to eliminate it altogether? Can you rearrange your schedule so you avoid something? Is there someone that you need to kind of reduce your exposure to or avoid altogether that's causing you stress? Look at that list and ask, what can I just avoid and get rid of altogether? That's a quick win. Once you've got rid of the things that you can avoid and you've identified that, then I want you to think about how you can alter some stresses. Now, This is for situations that you do not have direct control over. The things that we have influence over are usually other people. So that might mean speaking to someone to tell them that they need to alter their behavior and having a respectful conversation with them. Perhaps you need to put a boundary down. Perhaps you need to find a way to make something that's really stressful more enjoyable so it alters your experience of it. Look at it and think, what can I do to alter this situation to reduce my exposure to stress? Ultimately, the stress isn't going to go away without us doing something. And this is about taking a proactive approach. So an example of something that I was finding a bit stressful recently is I have a really, really high workload and I post on social media 6 days a week. And 2 weeks ago, with loads of talks coming up, I was like, I was feeling really overwhelmed. So I was like, right, what can I do? I took 1 month's worth of social content. I divided it over 2 months. So now suddenly I had 1 month of content that became 2. And that created so much less stress. I had space, I could breathe, things became a lot easier for me. But you have to look at ways that you can alter and change things in order for you to do that. Then acceptance. What are the things on your list that you have absolutely no control over? The thing is, we've got to change our relationship with those things, because the thing is, the things that you don't have any control over, the more you just focus on them and focus on them and focus on them, the bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger they get, right? Because you can't change them. They're unchangeable. You don't have direct control over them. But the more you invest time and energy focusing on them, they just blow up in our mind. So what do we need when it comes to finding acceptance? We need emotional regulation techniques, because what we learn at the beginning of this workshop is that chronic stress makes it much harder to regulate our emotions. So it's really important that you find a technique that works for you, that helps you regulate your emotions and helps increase your prefrontal control so you can find more calm and balance. So here are some suggestions. So short-term fixes are basically a way of distracting yourself by concentrating on something else to prevent negative emotions from taking over. This is a short-term fix. So if something has really upset you and you want to stifle an onslaught of negative emotions, play games on your smartphone like Tetris that are testing your memory or your reasoning skills, and absorb your attention and continue to play them until you lose yourself in that game and you're able to transiently forget what happened. That's a really easy win and a quick technique. Or find your flow. Now, flow denotes a state of being so absorbed in activity that you lose track of time and any unrelated thoughts or sensations are completely obliterated. So when you find your flow, the activity must be challenging enough for you to engage your rational brain, but not so challenging that you're losing interest because it feels too difficult or stressful. When you're in this state of flow and you're so heavily absorbed, it's really difficult for your emotional brain to surge unnecessary negative emotions. The Hungarian psychologist that first defined flow cites yoga practice, music, sports as an example that put people into this flow state where they're so absorbed that they lose track of time. For me, I find running does this. And people who incorporate more flow into their daily lives report feeling happier and less stressed. Then longer term fixes. Well, focused attention meditation, which is when you focus it's not woo-woo, it's literally about focusing your attention on a defined target. This is your home base from my study of meditation. This could be your breath, an object that you can look at, a sensation. For me, it's the sensation of my hands cupped in my lap. When you become distracted by a thought, which you will do, and that is completely normal, you simply notice that, you disengage from that thought, and you bring your attention back to your home base. Now, they've used MRIs to image people's brains when they are meditating, and they found areas of the prefrontal cortex light up when they are reining in their attention and whilst they're fixed on a target. So meditation is a form of brain training. It's helping you to achieve sustained focus and return to that focus when negative thinking hits. And there's some great evidence to suggest that it relieves symptoms of anxiety and depression. And from my own personal experience and from working with my clients, along with regular exercise, I think it's one of the most positive things we can do for our mental health. And lastly, expressive writing. This is a way of becoming your own therapist, and the therapeutic effects of it were first studied by James Pennebaker, who was a psychologist, and it's been shown to be a really powerful tool and something I use when needed. So when you write about a traumatic or stressful or an emotional event, this is found to result in improvements in psychological health when participants wrote about events for 15 to 20 minutes at a time for 5 separate occasions. This is known as the Penny Baker's paradigm that's been defined from this research. So you need to write about it for 15 to 20 minutes for at least 5 separate occasions. So you put that pen to paper, you write it out, you let that stressful energy flow out from you. And remember, it's for your eyes only. You're not thinking about spelling, about grammar, about writing normal sentences. This is a tool to help you process your emotions. Because unless you do that, those emotions get stuck. And holding those negative emotions in and suppressing them is going to cause more damage than good. So then adapt. Adapt is basically changing how you think. And this is what I believe to be the most powerful tool, but not only in our fight against stress, really about our quest of success. So your mindset encompasses your way of thinking, the attitude you bring to every day, your beliefs and assumptions. It encompasses how you view yourself, your place in the world around you, and it determines your decisions, your choices, and your actions, how you relate to other people, and also how you relate to stressful situations. Everything flows from your mindset. So your mindset influences your outcome, and that's why it's so powerful. So what I want to do with you is I specifically want to do some mindset work in the next concept and in our next coaching session on burnout, and teach you how to adapt your mindset so that you can live more happily, feel less stress, and actually be more successful in life. So master your mind. What we're going to do is we're going to start with some basic principles that I've created on how to master your mind for more happiness and less stress. Because remember, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. To give you an example of this is a story through 2 different lenses. We've got one's an emotional lens and one's a rational lens. Same story, very different outcome. Through the emotional lens, your really usual cheerful boss comes in, you smile at him, but he doesn't smile back at you. You wonder why. You start to worry. You create worst case scenarios. You think you've done something wrong. You start interpreting everything you hear with a strong negativity bias. You get yourself worked up. You feel anxious. You think some really bad news is coming. Same story through a rational lens. Your usually cheerful boss doesn't smile back at you. You wonder why. You think back logically and you remember a conversation you had with another colleague a few weeks ago where you understand that he's going through some personal problems. You've also thought, God, it's been really stressful around work recently, so he's probably under a lot of workplace stress himself. You feel a bit compassion, you think, oh, poor guy, and you crack on with your day. That is how, when you change the way you look at things, the things that you look at change. Same story, different outcome. One, lots of stress, anxiety, worst case scenarios, and distress. One, you see it, you identify it logically, and you crack on with your day. So, rule number 1 of mastering your mind, you become what you habitually think. Why? Because how you think depicts the emotions you generate, and that's how your body reacts and the type of stress that you generate, and then the behaviors you choose to make, which is then going to impact the outcome you get. Now, thoughts on their own have no power. It's only when we actively invest our attention into them that they begin to seem real. And when we engage with a specific thought, we begin to feel the emotion that's been triggered by these thoughts, and then we enter this new emotional state. Now, when you're under stress, as we've discussed, your emotional brain is in charge, and you're using your emotional brain to think. But this means that your logical, rational brain, your logical, irrational processes are all turned down. And since your emotional brain is there, that trained to seek out threat and negativity, it's got this strong bias towards negativity, you often get a distorted picture of reality, which can be the source of a lot of stress. And then you act on these erroneous assumptions. Because what your emotional brain does, it tends to jump to a theory or an assumption before looking for the facts. It's there to protect you from danger. It hasn't got time just to sit around and think. It jumps to an assumption. And this can lead to a really poor outcome and more stress. For example, if you're regularly engaging in a thought, I'm not good enough, I'm incompetent, I'm not good enough, I'm incompetent. And that is your internal language. And you're energizing that thought and you're giving attention to it. How's that going to make you feel over the long term? You're eventually going to feel anxious, have a low mood. Your body's going to be put into a state of distress. And when I work with my clients, it's that internal narrative, like I'm not good enough, that they've got, and that kind of belief that leads to things like people pleasing, an inability to say no, an inability to set boundaries, over functioning, doing more than is healthy or necessary, or in some of my clients, it leads to inaction. They want something, but they don't think they're good enough, so they don't take any action at all. All of that is going to lead to burnout, anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. But equally, the flip side is true. One of my jobs is really to study the most successful people in the world. And one thing I've really noticed about them is they have developed positive, powerful, flexible, and confident ways of thinking. Because if you're going to engage in more positive thoughts like, I've got this, I'm a badass, I can cope, I can do this, that's, as we've discussed, going to make you feel motivated, enthusiastic, confident. It's going to generate eustress. You're much more likely to be assertive, say no when you need to, put that boundary down, be proactive, and take constructive action. And that's going to lead you to thrive. So you become what you habitually think. The things that you're constantly giving your attention to become your reality. But remember, rule number 2 of mastering your mind is thoughts are not facts. You're all doctors here, and everything you do is evidence-based. Yeah, I bet you're believing a lot of negative thoughts and inner talk about yourself that simply aren't backed by evidence, yet are causing you a lot of distress. So remember, just because you think it, it doesn't mean it's real. You have 70 to 100,000 thoughts a day. 80% of these thoughts are negative. We are fighting a war of negativity in our own heads. You take in 9 bits of negative information for every 1 bit of positive information. This is how your brain was built to seek out threats. So cognitive distortions are something that you need to learn about because they are a huge cause of negative thinking and can cause a lot of distress. We all experience these frequently. Have you ever thought that you did really, really bad in an exam or a job interview and then you actually passed with flying colours? This is your mind leading you astray. Now, a distorted thought or cognitive distortion is an exaggerated pattern of thought that is not based on facts, and it consequently leads you to view things more negatively than they really are. So in other words, these cognitive distortions are your mind convincing you to believe negative things about yourself or about the world that are not necessarily true. So by being able to identify these distorted thoughts, you can start reversing the negative impact that this repetitive negative thinking is having on how you feel, and it will help you to reduce stress. So what I've done here is put the most common cognitive distortions that you can come back to. And I'd really like you to revisit these slides afterwards. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I wanted to introduce you to a few of them. Now, mental filtering. This is when you take all the negative details and you magnify them, you blow them up, and you filter out all the positives. You don't give any attention to them. So perhaps in a performance review, you've got loads of compliments and all the areas you're doing really, really well. But there's one area that you're not doing as well in, and and they talk about it. So you leave that meeting focusing on dwelling on that one bit of negative feedback, feeling really, really stressed. Or perhaps you do a presentation at work. And with those with all or nothing thinking, which is a trait of perfectionism, which we're going to talk about a lot in the burnout presentation because it's a real risk factor for burnout, where you think in extremes. Everything's all good or all bad, it's complete success or it's total failure. Perhaps you mess up on one of your slides, you get your words wrong, but you performed really well in the whole rest of your talk, but you finish that thinking, God, I was a failure. That was really, really rubbish. Or emotional reasoning. This is when you believe that the way you feel is a reflection of reality. You say to yourself, I feel this way about this situation, therefore it's a fact. So perhaps you're out in a social situation with friends or you're with colleagues or at work and you feel inadequate. That then becomes, I'm inadequate, I'm incompetent. Or catastrophizing, we've talked about that. There's a problem, but suddenly you blow it up to make the worst case possible scenario in your head. That's just going to leave you feeling really, really stressed and anxious. So cognitive distortions are the cause of a lot of distress. So you need to learn to identify them. And I really, really recommend that you come back and look through these slides. So rule number 3, I know it might not feel that way, but you are in charge of your mind, and it's really our responsibility to master it, because I really believe that unless we master our mind, everything else we do will be futile, because our mind governs everything that we do. So there are a few things that you need to remember. You cannot stop thoughts, but you can decide what you give your attention to. If it's an unhelpful or a destructive thought and you can recognize it, don't tolerate it. That's the simplest thing to do. You don't give your attention to it. It's up to you what you want to believe. You have a choice. Believing something that isn't backed up by evidence and facts, things like I'm not good enough or I don't have the ability to cope, it's up to you. But which belief is worth your investment? Is it really logical? Is it really rational that you're not good enough and you can't cope? Ultimately, if you want to reduce stress and thrive, you need to learn to develop more flexible, logical ways of thinking and not succumb to the negativity of cognitive distortions. And you do this by proactively engaging your logical brain and learning to challenge your thoughts. So I've put this process down for you. Next time, we're not always aware what's going on in our minds. And it's something some people are really acutely aware. And when I work with people, sometimes they haven't really connected with that, but you'll recognize it in your body. So next time you feel anxious, depressed, panicky, stressed, stop, slow down, check in. What's going on in the mind? Try and isolate the thought, write it down. If you're at work, pop it on your iPhone, and then you can come back and do this process later. Then look at it. Ask yourself, go back to that list. Is this a cognitive distortion? If so, what kind could it be? What evidence do I have to support this thought? What evidence suggests that this thought is untrue? In what way is this thought absurd or ridiculous? And what would I say to a friend who had this thought? This is all about turning up the volume of your logical, rational brain. This is about taking a second glance at your situation and gauging your logical, rational brain, re-examining it for evidence and rationally, and paying attention to perhaps subtle features that you might have missed before. When you do this and you're consistent with it, what you'll find is you often gather enough evidence to interpret a situation in a way that causes you less distress. And with practice, and by consistently using this technique, you teach yourself to read situations differently. You experience less stress. You develop more logical, rational, and flexible ways of thinking. You turn up your logical, rational brain. And ultimately, you learn to change your mindset by changing how you think. Right, how's everyone doing? Well, moving on to our last concept. You're doing brilliantly. Well done for staying with me. Right. So I wanted to talk about extinguishing inflammation because, as we have already discussed, chronic inflammation that results from chronic stress is detrimental to our bodies, both physically and particularly to our mental health. So a way of bolstering us against stress from a body approach is thinking about how we can reduce any unnecessary inflammation within our bodies. Now, certain lifestyle factors, such as lack of exercise, poor diet, alcohol, smoking, can all potentiate inflammation. And the way I approach it with my clients is to focus on one area that I believe, from my research, will have a good all-round impact and actually encompasses lots of ways of thinking in terms of sleep and nutrition and all of these things, and will help bolster us against stress. And that is through your gut microbiome. Now, there has been a lot of hype around the gut microbiome, and it's for a really good reason. And there's some great research articles that I have included at the end of this workshop. I first heard about it in 2018 when I heard Tim Spector on a BBC podcast talking about fecal transplants, and it absolutely fascinated me. And since then, my interest in it has grown and grown. And I really believe that the knowledge I gained and the routines that I put in place from this wealth of knowledge that I learned about how to nurture my gut microbiome has been instrumental in my recovery from depression. So how does your gut microbiome help reduce inflammation? Well, there's 3 ways. First, it prevents microbes entering your digestive tract from entering your body, causing inflammation through maintaining a healthy gut wall. And also it tries to fight any kind of foreign germs entering your gut. But there's also evidence to suggest that the microbiome shifts the balance of immune cells through its effects on regulatory T cells. They are less likely to trigger unnecessary inflammation. And lastly, there's some evidence that your gut microbiome actually communicates with your brain via microbial metabolites and cytokines and can actually help modify your stress response. So as a body approach, I think it's a great place to start. So as I always do with my clients, what are the things that we need to stop doing because they're potentiating something or making it worse? And what's one thing that we could start doing? Now, there's lots of things that damage our gut microbiome: alcohol, processed foods, high sugar foods, consistent use of NSAIDs, unnecessary antibiotics, stress, lack of sleep, and a lack of dietary fiber. MAC stands for microbiota accessible carbohydrates. These are carbohydrates that are difficult to digest, but they feed your gut microbiome. So what we need to do in order to build a healthy gut microbiome is we need to think about increasing the number of microbes as well as the diversity. So you want the right number and a big kind of range of microbes in your gut to have the most robust microbiome. Now, there are many ways to do it, but I think time-restricted eating is one of the best and is easy for you guys to do. Now, there are many ways to fast, and I think one of the most common is kind of intermittent. So this involves you switching between periods of eating and fasting. So you eat within a set window of time every day. For example, 16-8, you fast for 16 hours a day, and then you eat within an 8-hour window. So for example, you might have breakfast at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then you have your last meal at 6 p.m. Outside of your eating window, you consume black tea, black coffee, herbal teas, and water. No booze. Somebody has got that. I haven't made that clear before. No booze outside of your eating window. What happens when you fast is your gut microbes proliferate during periods of fasting. They increase in number and diversity. And during your kind of periods of fasting, the gut microbes, specifically a variety called the Akkermansia, if I pronounce that properly, snack off your gut lining. They basically clean it up, which in turn improves the diversity of other microbes. And this action also increases the function of your gut barrier. When I get my clients fasting, they report more energy, sustained focus, better mood from fasting. So it's something that I really, really recommend. There's so much research on loads of other benefits. I could talk about the gut microbiome for days. We haven't got time today, but it's just a brilliant thing that you should do for your health. It's not great if you're pregnant. I wouldn't be recommending it. If you're a type 1 diabetic, absolutely not. You need to make sure that it's right for you. Other things, probiotics. Now, these are foods that contain live gut-friendly bacteria, and consuming these will increase the number and diversity of microbes in your microbiome. You can find these in live yogurt, kefir, kombucha, miso paste, sauerkraut, kimchi. After I went through that period of burnout, I actually my kitchen became a bit of a science lab. I had water kefir growing, I had normal kefir growing, and I grew my own kombucha. Now I have kefir every day. You need to have probiotics every day for them to be effective. So I have my kefir with soaked oats, bananas, flax seeds. I make a smoothie with it, and I enjoy sauerkraut regularly. Then we've got prebiotics. So these are the non-digestible fibers, which are components of foods that act as fertilizers, and they're feeding your gut, giving them something to thrive on. So it's estimated that a healthy person needs approximately 6 grams of prebiotics a day to keep both themselves and their microbes healthy. Now, you can find them in lots of things: Jerusalem artichokes, garlic, onions, leeks, asparagus, wheat bran, cauliflower. The amount between different foods varies considerably. So there's like 65%, for example, in chicory root, but just 1% in bananas. And it's important to know that when you cook foods, that those amounts of prebiotics decrease. So the best way of doing it is just to make sure you're eating a wide variety of fruit and vegetables. I always recommend 2 prebiotic-rich foods to every meal, including breakfast. Alternatively, Tim Spector recommends a teaspoon of diced chicory root or Jerusalem artichoke. That apparently does the trick. And lastly, coffee. Did you know that coffee has a high fiber content? There's half a gram in per cup. And it's the combination of fiber and the polyphenols that provides food for our gut and microbes to thrive, because what the microbes do is they break down the fiber, they produce key short chain fatty acids, which allows other helpful microbial species to increase. So it's important to think, what's one thing that I'm doing right now that's damaging my gut microbiome? Am I drinking too much? Am I eating, is my diet not great? Am I not prioritizing my sleep enough? And I know that's difficult for you guys, and we'll talk about that more on Wednesday. What's one thing that you could stop doing? And then what's one thing that you could try and implement? Play around with it, try time restricted eating, see if it works for you. I don't think we should be trying to change too many things at once. That's not how we create change. We need to think in terms of ones. One things I need to stop doing, one thing I could start doing, and then get consistent with that before you start adding anything else. Makes it less overwhelming. So, thank you for staying with me. We have covered a lot today. We've talked about stress, we've talked about psychological stress triggers, about how stress has triggered within our brain. We've talked about different types of stress, positive stress, negative stress, the biological stress response and general adaptation syndrome. We've talked about how chronic stress changes our brain. We've talked about how stress generates inflammation and increases our risk of depression. And we've also talked about the relationship between stress and performance and how we can generate more positive stress in our lives. Then we went on to 3 critical concepts, the 4 A's: avoid, alter, accept, and adapt. Then I've started to introduce you to some mindset work, the link between thoughts, feelings, stress, and behavior, the fact that thoughts are not facts. We've talked through some common cognitive distortions, and I've given you a way that you can move through a strategic way to learn to challenge your thoughts, to engage your rational brain and reduce the stress. And lastly, we've talked about a body approach to reducing stress through reducing inflammation by nurturing your gut microbiome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cordelia. Really, really informative presentation, really helpful. I'm just going to head over to the chat function. Lots of positive feedback, but there was a question relating specifically to the kind of dietary slide that you had a few minutes ago. Questions from Natchaya, and she's asked, can we use flavored water without sugar during fasting periods? I don't know.
Oh, that's a hard one. So anything that's got any form of sugars in, and even lemons will have sugars in, are going to affect your blood glucose, and you don't want that to happen. So that actually wouldn't be fasting. So I know that sounds so boring, but I would stay away from flavored waters, and I would just stick to, what about using something like a herbal tea instead and letting that go cold? I would stay away from putting any fruits in your water because that's going to have sugar and then it's not going to be fasting anymore. Sorry to be boring.
Perfect. Any questions, anyone? Feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat function. We have a few more minutes. Okay, so Aaron's got a question. I don't know if you can see it in the chat function, Cordelia. Oh, a few more questions popping up. So Aaron's asked, how long does it typically take for the stress response to subside for chronic stress after implementing the 4 A's of stress management?
That's an interesting one. I guess that in terms of chronic stress, how long does it take to, so in terms of the 4 A's of stress management, I guess it's going to be determined by what you actually do, right? So that's going to be more of a personal thing. Chronic stress, to recover from that, can take up to 2 weeks to recover from chronic stress. And the acute stress response lasts for days. And after the stressor is removed, you normally see your stress levels normalizing within 3 to 5 days. But in terms of using the 4 A's, I guess that's going to be determined by how effective your stress management is. Ultimately, the more quickly you remove the stressors, the more quickly you'll recover from chronic stress.
And we've got another question from Charlotte, who's asked, does decaf coffee have the same benefit as normal coffee regarding fiber?
I don't think it does. I'm pretty sure that it doesn't, but I will, Charlotte, drop your email and I'll look at my research paper on that. Drop your email in there and I'll message you back, but I'm 99.9% sure that it doesn't have the same benefit.
And Cody's raised a fair question that I think many of us who do on-calls have probably struggled with. He said, how do you advise fasting when I start work at 8 a.m. and don't get home till 6 p.m. at the earliest?
You've got to make it work for you. So I've coached so many doctors, and I think for in terms of what works for you? So who do you have a family? Do you want to be eating an evening meal with them? So for a lot of the time, my clients will say, look, when I get home at 6 p.m, I want to eat an evening meal with my wife, with my partner. So then what we'll do is they'll have that evening meal and then we'll work backwards from there. So say you're getting home at 6, you're eating dinner at 7. Can you hold out until 8 hours before then? So like 11 o'clock in the morning to eat your first meal. Or for example, on night shifts, again, it's different, and it's very much depending on, everyone responds differently. On night shifts, I used to eat my last meal before going on shift. So before I left the house, I used to eat a big meal that I digest on my hour-and-a-half commute to work. I actually used to fast through the whole of my night shift. And then the only time I've ever advised to eat close to bed was I would then eat when I got home from my night shift, because that helped me fall asleep. Having that fullness in my stomach to help me get to sleep. So I think it's really about deciding, you want to eat one meal a day with someone. If you're with someone, is that going to be breakfast or that going to be dinner, and work your way back from that.
We've got another question from Karen, who said, if you've been suffering with heightened anxiety for a substantial period of time, can it take some time before things start to get better? For context, with a diagnosis of ADHD or potential ASD being investigated for.
So are you saying, Karen, that what's causing your anxiety state has been removed, as in, and then you're in that period of recovery? Ultimately, anxiety is a state of chronic fear. It's sustained fear. It's like your amygdala continues to fire. And when we're in, sorry, yeah, come on. Is somebody saying anything? No. So is that fear still there? Are you still in that fear-driven situation? Because if not, then that anxiety is not going to go unless you choose to take action. What happens when you're in anxiety? You're in this chronic state of fear, and your body is releasing loads and loads of adrenaline because it's saying to you, can you make a decision? We need you to fight or flee. Can you do something? But when you're in anxiety, you're stuck. So in terms of the recovery period, if that fear has been dealt with, then you can expect to recover. But if you haven't dealt with that fear, then that anxiety won't go anywhere.
So Karen's just messaged back saying the fear seems to be getting worse.
Okay, so then that fear needs to be dealt with, because the anxiety won't get it. So you can't solve a problem unless you identify it. And I can't remember the quote about it. So what is that fear? And then I would take my clients on a really strategic process to help reduce the risk of that fear occurring, and then to actually say to yourself, if the worst case scenario was to happen, play that out, write that down. What does that look like? Could I handle it? And what ways could you reduce the risk of that fear turning out? So let me describe how you do that. In terms of that fear, write down all your what ifs, all your doubts, all your worst case scenarios, or all your nightmares. Put them all down. Then in the second column, you're going to write down ways that you can reduce the risk of those occurring. What are the small actions you can take and big actions to reduce those things occurring? Then you have a repair column. And in that repair column, you say, okay, if this thing did happen, what could I do to get myself back on track? It's a very psychological mechanism when dealing with fear, because fear is psychological. So we need to look at it really logically and rationally to help shrink that fear. Hopefully that was helpful.
And we've got another question from Matt, who said, any suggestions for perimenopausal women suffering from hormonal imbalance and high stress?
You know what, that's one thing I would say is, in terms of fasting, I would be careful about fasting if you're perimenopausal. I don't think it always works very well in menopausal women, and I've actually coached some and pulled people off of it because I just don't think that it's great for you. I think a really important thing to be looked at during the menopause is diet. You need to be all over your diet. That's, from my experience, one of the most powerful things we can do.
Perfect. Any other questions? Please feel free to unmute your mics and voice them yourselves or type them up in the chat box. I appreciate we've overrun a little bit. Okay. If not, then I think we can start winding up. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who joined. Special thanks to
thank you, everybody.
for hosting. Really, really helpful slides and presentation. We're really looking forward to seeing you all on Wednesday.